Don't mind him. He's just a failure. My son's voice echoed across the reception hall loud enough to silence every conversation at the nearest tables. Several guests laughed. Someone clinked a champagne glass against another. A woman covered her mouth, unsure whether she should smile or look away. I remained standing beside the dessert table with a half-finished glass of sparkling water in my hand. My name is Richard Carter. I'm 68 years old, a widower, and until that moment, I thought I'd already experienced every kind of humiliation a man could survive. I was wrong. My son Ethan raised his own champagne glass toward a group of his new in-laws. I'm serious, he said with another laugh. Don't feel bad if he doesn't have much to say. Dad's been retired forever. Never really did anything afterward. Just kind of drifted. Another ripple of laughter. One of the businessmen beside him asked politely, "So what did your father do before retirement?" Ethan shrugged. "Army stuff. Nothing exciting. He left years ago and never made much of himself after that." I looked down at the wrinkles on my old navy blue sport coat. The jacket was nearly 15 years old. The cuffs had faded. The leather elbows were beginning to crack. I could have worn an Italian suit worth several $1,000s. There were 3 hanging untouched inside my closet. Instead, I chose this jacket because it had belonged to my late wife. Emily used to tease me whenever I wore expensive clothes. "You scare people," she'd laugh. "Wear something comfortable for once." So I had. Not because I couldn't afford anything better, because every time I slipped my arms into those sleeves, I could almost hear her voice again. Ethan had no idea. His mother had been gone for 9 years. Sometimes I wondered if grief had taken her twice, once from this world, and once from our son. The ballroom overlooked Charleston Harbor. Outside, the evening sun painted the water gold while sailboats drifted across the horizon. Inside, crystal chandeliers reflected warm light onto polished hardwood floors. Everything about the reception screamed money. The bride's parents owned several commercial real estate companies throughout South Carolina. Their guest list included judges, surgeons, politicians, investment managers, and executives. I fit in about as well as an old pickup truck parked in front of a country club, which suited Ethan just fine. He had spent years trying to reinvent himself. Today, he was finally becoming part of the wealthy family he'd always admired. Unfortunately, I was the one reminder he couldn't hide. The bride Lauren glanced toward me. Her smile weakened. "Honey," she whispered softly. "Maybe." "It's okay," Ethan interrupted. "Dad knows I'm joking." He looked directly at me. "Right," I smiled. "I've heard worse." That was true. Much worse. Insults don't carry much weight after you've spent decades delivering folded American flags to grieving families. After you've looked 18-year-old soldiers in the eye before sending them into places neither of you could fully understand. After you've stood beside hospital beds wondering whether a young corporal would wake up. Words lose some of their power. Silence becomes stronger. I took a sip of water. "Congratulations, son." He nodded casually. "Thanks." No apology, none expected. Across the room, a string quartet continued playing as servers carried plates of filet mignon and roasted vegetables between tables. Everything returned to normal, or at least everyone pretended it had, except one man. I noticed him almost immediately. Gray hair, broad shoulders, straight posture, civilian tuxedo, military eyes. If you've served long enough, you recognize certain things instinctively. How someone scans a room, how they position themselves near exits, how they unconsciously stand balanced on both feet instead of leaning casually. The man had been watching me since Ethan made his joke. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't offended. He looked confused, as though he recognized someone he hadn't expected to see. I looked away. Recognition happened occasionally, especially near Charleston. Retired military officers settled throughout the Carolinas. Most simply nodded. Some shook my hand. Others respected my privacy. That was how I preferred it. Emily used to tell me, "You've spent 40 years wearing stars on your shoulders. Maybe spend the rest of your life just being Richard." I promised her I would. And promises made to dying wives should never be broken, especially that one. The waiter approached. "Sir, would you like wine?" "No, thank you." "Champagne?" "I'm driving." He smiled politely before moving on. Ethan's new father-in-law stepped onto the small stage. He tapped a fork against his glass. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for joining our families tonight." Applause filled the room. He spoke warmly about marriage, commitment, family traditions, then invited anyone close to the couple to offer a toast. Several friends shared funny college stories. Lauren's maid of honor cried halfway through hers. Finally. Someone called Ethan's name. He walked confidently toward the microphone. I just want to thank everyone for believing in us. More applause. And especially Lauren's family. He gestured toward the elegant tables. You've shown me what success really looks like. I felt something tighten inside my chest. Not because he'd complimented them, because I already knew what was coming. My dad, Ethan continued. Well, the room chuckled before he'd even finished. You've all met him. More laughter. He always told me character mattered more than money. He paused dramatically. I decided I'd rather have both. Louder laughter. Someone actually applauded. I looked at the floor. Not because I was embarrassed, because I suddenly remembered another evening nearly 30 years earlier. Ethan was 10. He'd struck out during a Little League game. He sat on the curb afterward crying because he thought he'd let the team down. I knelt beside him. Son, I told him one bad inning doesn't decide who you become. He looked up. Promise. I promise. I wasn't sure when he'd stop believing me or when I'd stopped earning that trust. Maybe somewhere between deployments, missed birthdays, canceled vacations, late-night phone calls from overseas. Children measure love differently than adults. They count days, not sacrifices. The applause faded. I returned to the present. Ethan stepped away from the microphone. Servers began clearing dinner plates. The quartet resumed playing. Then, a chair slowly slid backward. Its legs scraped across the hardwood floor. Every head turned. The gray-haired man I'd noticed earlier stood from his table, deliberately, calmly. His wife touched his sleeve. He smiled gently. It's all right. He buttoned his tuxedo jacket, then walked toward me. Not quickly, not dramatically, just with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime making difficult walks. Halfway across the ballroom, he stopped. His eyes met mine. His expression softened. Then in front of more than 200 wedding guests, he came to attention. Every instinct inside me told me exactly what was about to happen. I silently wished he wouldn't. He raised his right hand, a perfect military salute. Then he spoke in a voice strong enough for the entire ballroom to hear. Excuse me. He looked directly at my son. Young man. A silence settled over the reception so complete that even the musicians lowered their instruments. The man drew one slow breath. Do you have any idea who your father really is? No one spoke. For several long seconds, the only sound inside the ballroom came from the waves outside the harbor windows. The retired officer kept his hand raised in a crisp salute. I sighed quietly. At ease, General. He lowered his hand immediately. Yes, sir. That single word spread through the room like a crack of thunder. Sir. I heard whispers behind me. Did he say, General, who is that man? What is this about? Ethan stood frozen beside Lauren, still holding his champagne glass. He laughed nervously. I think you've got the wrong person. The retired officer looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and pity. No. His voice remained calm. I most certainly do not. Before anyone else could speak, I stepped forward. General Harris. He smiled. It's been a long time, sir. It has. He reached out and we shook hands. Not like strangers. Not even like old friends. Like two soldiers who had once shared responsibilities few civilians could ever understand. I didn't know you lived in Charleston, I said. My wife convinced me to retire here. I nodded. Emily always loved this city. His expression softened. I heard about her. 9 years. I'm sorry, sir. So am I. The room remained silent. People weren't staring anymore. They were listening. General Harris glanced toward Ethan again. I apologize for interrupting your wedding reception. Ethan forced a smile. No, it's okay. It isn't. The general folded his hands behind his back. I simply couldn't remain seated after hearing your father described that way. Ethan looked confused. I was joking. Were you? No anger, no accusation. Just one honest question. Ethan didn't answer. Lauren gently touched his arm. He barely noticed. One of the guests finally asked, How do you know Mr. Carter? General Harris looked toward me for permission. I gave a small nod. There wasn't much point hiding anymore. He commanded me. Another silence. Someone laughed awkwardly. I mean, like your boss. The general smiled faintly. No, he was my commanding officer. I watched dozens of faces trying to understand what those words meant. Most civilians hear commanding officer and think of an office manager. Military people hear something very different. The man responsible for every decision, every mission, every life, every letter sent home. General Harris looked back at me. I served under General Richard Carter for almost 7 years. There it was, the title I'd spent years avoiding. General. I almost wished he hadn't said it. Almost. Because once certain doors open, they never completely close again. Ethan blinked several times. Dad. He looked at me as though seeing a stranger. You were, I answered quietly. I retired from the Army. I know that. No. General Harris spoke gently. You know he served. You don't know what he became. The ballroom had become completely still again. Even the catering staff had stopped moving. The wedding coordinator looked ready to cry. This wasn't in her schedule. Neither was the truth. I never intended my son to learn about my career this way. Emily and I had talked about it countless times. She always believed children deserved ordinary parents. Not heroes, not celebrities, just parents. When Ethan was little, she'd take my medals out of storage every Veterans Day. He'd ask questions. What are those for? She'd smile. They're reminders that your father came home. That was enough. When he got older, he stopped asking. Teenagers rarely care about old photographs, especially when they're angry. His resentment grew one missed birthday at a time, one canceled fishing trip, one Christmas spent overseas, one deployment after another. I never blamed him. Children don't measure sacrifice. They measure absence. I was absent. Far too often. There isn't a metal on earth that changes that fact. I grew up in a farming town outside Bowling Green, Kentucky. My father repaired tractors. My mother worked nights at a nursing home. We weren't poor enough to starve, but close enough to understand the value of every dollar. At 18, I enlisted in the Army because college wasn't possible. I planned to stay 4 years, earn an education, leave. Life had other plans. I discovered I was good at leading people. Not because I enjoyed giving orders, because I hated wasting lives. Every promotion meant more responsibility, less sleep, harder decisions. At 24, I became an officer. At 32, I was commanding battalions. By 45, I was wearing stars. Emily used to joke, you keep getting promoted because nobody else wants the headaches. She wasn't wrong. Every promotion costs something. Usually time with family, sometimes friendships, sometimes sleep, occasionally pieces of yourself. The Army teaches leadership. It also teaches compartmentalization. You learn to put fear in one box, grief in another, regret somewhere else. Then you keep moving because everyone else is watching. The trouble begins after retirement. Those boxes eventually open, all at once. General Harris interrupted my thoughts. May I tell them something? I hesitated. He saw it. I won't embarrass you. I know. I looked around the room. More than 200 people waiting, watching, wondering. I remembered something Emily told me shortly before she died. One day, Ethan will have questions. I'll answer them. No, she squeezed my hand. Life will. I never understood what she meant, until now. I nodded. You may. General Harris faced the guests. When I first met General Carter, I closed my eyes for a second. There was that title again. I was 28 years old. I thought leadership meant being the loudest man in the room. A few guests smiled. He taught me I was wrong. He pointed toward me. That man never asked anyone to do something he wouldn't do himself. He visited wounded soldiers before attending award ceremonies. He memorized the names of spouses. He attended funerals personally. He knew birthdays. He wrote letters. He listened. The room had become so quiet I could hear silverware settling onto china plates. Ethan stared at me. His expression had changed. The confidence was gone. Confusion had taken its place. Dad, his voice cracked. Why didn't you ever tell me any of this? I answered honestly. Because I wanted you to know me. Not my rank. His eyes dropped toward the floor. But you never asked. The words came out softer than I intended. Not an accusation. Simply the truth. Lauren looked from me to Ethan, then back again. For the first time that evening, I saw tears gathering in her eyes. General Harris wasn't finished. He looked around the ballroom one more time, then smiled. You've only heard a fraction of the story. He turned toward the back of the room. And I don't believe I'm the only person here who served under him. Heads began turning. I followed their gaze. Near the corner table, another elderly man slowly pushed back his chair, then another, and another. 3 veterans stood almost simultaneously, each wearing civilian suits, each carrying themselves with unmistakable military discipline. My heart sank. Oh no, not all of you. 3 elderly men rose from different corners of the ballroom. No one had noticed them before. Why would they? They weren't dressed in uniforms. One wore a charcoal suit with a faded American flag lapel pin. Another leaned slightly on a polished wooden cane. The third was tall, silver-haired, and carried himself with the quiet confidence that never truly leaves career military officers. They looked at one another, then they looked at me. For a brief moment, nearly 30 years disappeared. I wasn't standing in an elegant Charleston ballroom anymore. I was standing inside briefing rooms, command tents, airfields before sunrise, hospitals where hope fought against reality. The first man walked toward us. I recognized him before he said a word. Colonel David Monroe. He smiled. You remembered. I remember everyone who ever gave me gray hair. A few guests laughed softly. The tension eased for exactly 3 seconds. Then Colonel Monroe stopped in front of me, his back straightened, his shoulders squared. Without saying a word, he saluted. Perfectly. The second veteran joined him, then the third. 3 retired officers, 3 flawless salutes. The ballroom fell completely silent. I returned the salute slowly, not because protocol required it, because respect did. The moment ended. The officers lowered their hands. General Harris turned toward the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, he paused. I realize this probably looks unusual. You've spent the last 20 minutes wondering why several old men suddenly forgot they were attending a wedding. A few nervous chuckles drifted across the room. We didn't forget. He smiled. We simply recognized the man who taught us what leadership actually looks like. Someone near the back whispered, "My goodness." Another guest quietly took out a phone, not to record, to search. I noticed. So did General Harris. He ignored it. Instead, he looked toward Ethan. You called your father a failure. Ethan swallowed hard. I didn't mean... General Harris gently raised a hand. I'm not here to embarrass you. His voice carried no anger. No soldier worthy of General Carter would ever humiliate another person. He looked at me briefly before continuing. But I do think you deserve to know who raised you. He began with a story I'd completely forgotten. It was Afghanistan. We'd been operating for almost 72 hours. No sleep. Little food. Everyone was exhausted. He smiled faintly. I was still a colonel then. I thought I had all the answers. Several veterans in the room laughed knowingly. I didn't. Our convoy received reports of possible roadside explosives. The safest decision was to delay. I recommended waiting. He looked at me. General Carter listened. He asked questions. He considered every option. Then he looked at the map. General Harris chuckled. He saw something I missed. He always did. The route we'd chosen would have delayed medical supplies reaching an aid station filled with wounded civilians. The ballroom remained silent. He didn't ask which decision would protect his career. He asked which decision would save the most lives. General Harris folded his hands. That's leadership. He accepted full responsibility. If anything had gone wrong, his career would have ended. It didn't, because he was right. I shifted uncomfortably. I also remember getting lost twice that week. General laughter spread through the room. General Harris grinned. Yes, sir. You absolutely did. I've never let you forget it. No, you haven't. Even Ethan smiled for a second. It disappeared almost immediately. He was trying to reconcile 2 completely different fathers, the man he believed he'd known and the man standing before him. Colonel Monroe stepped forward. My turn. General Harris nodded. I was a young captain. I made a terrible mistake. He looked directly at Ethan. A mistake serious enough to end my career. The room grew still again. I expected General Carter to destroy me. Instead, he smiled toward me. You asked one question. I remembered immediately. Did anyone get hurt? Colonel Monroe nodded. When I answered no, you said... He looked at me. Then let's make sure nobody gets hurt next time. He turned back toward the guests. That conversation saved my career. My daughter's a physician today. My son's a firefighter. My grandchildren exist because one commander believed correcting someone mattered more than destroying them. He cleared his throat. I've tried to lead people that way ever since. Lauren quietly wiped a tear from her cheek. Her mother reached over and squeezed her hand. Across the room, Ethan stood perfectly still. He hadn't spoken in several minutes. The third officer finally approached. He hadn't said a word until now. He stopped directly in front of Ethan. My name is Frank Sullivan. I retired as a command sergeant major. He smiled gently. I never cared much about officers. The veterans laughed. Except one. He pointed toward me. When my wife was diagnosed with cancer, I requested emergency leave. It was denied. Several guests frowned. Sullivan continued. General Carter called me into his office. I assumed I was in trouble. Instead, he smiled. He asked one question. How soon do you need to leave? I said, Today, sir. What happened? Lauren asked softly. Sullivan's eyes glistened. He personally overrode the paperwork. He arranged transportation. He made sure my family had financial assistance. He even called the hospital. I blinked. I don't remember calling. You probably don't. Sullivan smiled sadly. You did things like that every week. You just never talked about them. His words struck me harder than I expected. Maybe because they were true. When you've spent decades solving other people's crises, they eventually blur together. Not because they weren't important, because every family deserved the same attention. Every soldier deserved the same dignity. More guests were searching their phones now. I saw expressions changing. One businessman leaned toward another. I found him. What? Richard Carter. His voice became quieter. Oh my God. Another guest whispered, he retired with 4 stars. Someone else murmured, look at these photographs. They're from the Pentagon. Across the ballroom, Lauren's father slowly lowered his phone. He stared at me with complete disbelief. Then he walked over. General Carter. I smiled awkwardly. Richard is fine. He shook his head. I had no idea. That was intentional. He looked genuinely embarrassed. I should have introduced myself earlier. You already did. No. He glanced around the room. I introduced myself to the quiet old man. His voice became softer. I never realized I was speaking to someone who carried so much responsibility. I smiled. You were speaking to exactly the same man. That answer seemed to affect him more than anything else said that evening. Then something happened I never could have predicted. An elderly couple approached. I didn't recognize them. The woman smiled through tears. You won't remember us. I probably should. Our son served in your division. My heart skipped. What was his name? Michael Reynolds. The name hit me immediately. Young, brilliant, gone too soon. I remember Michael. The father reached into his wallet. He removed an old, carefully folded letter. The night our son died, you wrote to us. He unfolded the worn paper with trembling hands. We've carried it for 21 years. My throat tightened. I never expected to meet you. The mother gently touched my arm. We only wanted to say, thank you for making sure our son was remembered. The ballroom had become silent once again. Even Ethan looked as though he could barely breathe. Then General Harris looked around the room one final time. He spoke quietly. Ladies and gentlemen, the greatest leaders never spend their lives convincing people they're important. He looked directly at my son. The people they serve, do that for them. I looked at Ethan. For the first time since he was a little boy, I saw uncertainty instead of pride. And beneath that uncertainty, I saw something else beginning to appear. Regret. Regret has a look. It isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It settles into a person's face little by little, replacing certainty with questions they wish they'd asked years earlier. I saw it happening to Ethan. He wasn't looking at the retired general anymore. He wasn't looking at the veterans standing around me. He was looking at me, as if he were trying to remember every conversation we'd ever had and wondering how he'd missed an entire lifetime. The reception had come to a complete stop. The string quartet quietly packed away their instruments. Dinner plates sat untouched. Even the bartender stopped pouring drinks. No one wanted to interrupt what had become something much bigger than a wedding. Lauren finally broke the silence. She stepped beside me. Mr. Carter? I smiled. You can still call me Richard. She nodded. Richard? Her voice trembled. Why didn't anyone know? I looked around the ballroom. Because I didn't want them to. But, she glanced toward the officers. You earned all of this. I shook my head. No, I earned retirement. The respect belongs to the soldiers who trusted me. General Harris smiled. That's exactly why we respected you. Lauren's father approached again. His name was Charles Whitmore, successful businessman, confident, a man who usually had an answer for everything. Tonight he looked like someone attending the wrong event. He extended his hand once more. I owe you an apology. There isn't one to owe. There is. He looked genuinely uncomfortable. When Ethan introduced you this afternoon, I assumed, he hesitated. I assumed you were simply a quiet old man. He gave an embarrassed laugh. Something like that. I've been called worse. He looked directly into my eyes. You've also probably been underestimated before. Many times. And I've learned that people usually reveal more about themselves than about me. Charles nodded slowly. I'll remember that. Across the room, one of the younger guests suddenly looked up from his phone. I found an article. Everyone turned. He hesitated. I'm sorry. I don't want to invade anyone's privacy. General Harris answered for me. Go ahead. The young man cleared his throat. It says General Richard Carter retired after 44 years of service. Another guest added, there's another article. He received the Distinguished Service Medal. Someone else spoke. And the Defense Distinguished Service Medal. Another voice came from the back. Look at this. He turned his phone toward the people beside him. It says he turned down private defense consulting worth millions after retirement. Several heads turned toward me. Charles looked stunned. You refused that several times? Why? I smiled. Because Emily had already waited 44 years. The answer landed heavily across the room. I promised her retirement would belong to us. General Harris quietly added, he kept that promise. I looked toward the harbor windows. I tried. Lauren's mother suddenly covered her mouth. Oh my goodness. Everyone looked at her. I know your wife, I smiled. You probably don't. No. She shook her head. I never met her. She picked up her phone. My church runs a scholarship fundraiser every spring. She scrolled through several pages. We've received anonymous donations for years. She looked up. The donor always requested no publicity. She turned the screen toward me. The name on the tax document simply read, E. Carter Family Foundation. Lauren looked from the phone to me. That was you. It was Emily's idea. General Harris laughed softly. Of course it was, I smiled. She handled generosity. I handled paperwork. A ripple of warm laughter spread through the ballroom. The tension eased, not because people admired me, because they were beginning to understand Emily. Without her, none of this would have mattered. Ethan finally found his voice. Dad, he took one hesitant step forward. Were those donations all yours, ours? What do you mean, your mother's? He frowned. Mom's been gone for years. She planned most of it before she passed away. Lauren looked surprised. She planned donations after she died. She planned kindness. I remembered those evenings perfectly. Emily sitting at the kitchen table, stacks of envelopes, scholarship applications, military family charities, widow assistance programs. She always said the same thing. If we're lucky enough to have more than we need, then someone else should benefit. When cancer took her, I simply continued what she started. Quietly, exactly the way she wanted. No newspaper stories, no plaques, no speeches, just checks mailed every month. One of the veterans laughed. You know what always drove us crazy? General Harris smiled knowingly. I think I do. Colonel Monroe pointed toward me. He hated ceremonies. The guests looked surprised. Hated them, Sullivan nodded. If someone tried to praise him publicly, he'd disappear before the reception started. General Harris chuckled. One time we organized a retirement dinner. He escaped through the kitchen. The ballroom burst into genuine laughter. Even I couldn't help smiling. I was hungry. You stole a pie. I paid for the pie. You absolutely stole it. I left money. The veterans laughed harder. For the first time that evening, the room didn't feel divided. It felt human. Not because of rank, because people finally saw the ordinary man hidden behind it. Then Charles quietly asked the question no one else dared. If you had all this, he gestured toward the phones displaying photographs, awards, and military ceremonies. Why let your own son believe you were unsuccessful? The room became quiet again. I looked toward Ethan, then I answered, because I thought someday he'd judge me by the man I became after retirement. I paused, not the rank I held before it. No one spoke. I continued. I wanted my grandchildren to know Richard, not General Carter. I wanted my neighbors to know the widower who mowed his own lawn, the man who volunteered at the food bank, the grandfather who watched Little League games. I believed, I smiled sadly, that would be enough. Ethan lowered his head. It should have been. His voice barely rose above a whisper. It should have been enough. Lauren gently took his hand. He squeezed it tightly. She whispered something only he could hear. Then she looked at me. I wish I'd met your wife. You would have liked her. I already do. I smiled. So do I. Every day. The wedding planner quietly approached Charles. We're almost 2 hours behind schedule. He looked around the ballroom, then smiled. I think everyone's exactly where they're supposed to be. Nobody argued. Nobody wanted dancing. Nobody cared about the cake anymore. Something much more important was happening. A family was finally telling the truth. Ethan slowly walked toward me, not confidently, like the successful executive who had proudly welcomed guests earlier that evening. This was different. This was the little boy who used to wait by the front window whenever I came home from deployment. He stopped only a few feet away. His eyes were red. His hands trembled slightly. I've spent years telling people, he swallowed hard, that my father never accomplished much. He looked directly into my eyes. I was wrong. I saw the shame all over his face. But I didn't want shame. Not from him. Not tonight. What I wanted was honesty. And for the first time in a very long time, I believed we were finally close enough to have it. No one moved. Not even the photographers. For nearly 2 hours, they had been chasing smiles, laughter, and perfect wedding moments. Now they quietly lowered their cameras. Some memories don't belong in photographs. They belong in hearts. Ethan stood only a few feet away from me. His eyes were fixed on the floor. I'm sorry, he whispered. The words were barely audible. I heard them anyway. I know, his head lifted. I know you're sorry. He swallowed. But you haven't forgiven me. I smiled gently. Those are two different things. The ballroom remained silent. People weren't waiting for drama anymore. They were waiting for something much harder. Truth. Lauren stepped forward. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. Richard, I don't know what to say. You don't have to. I feel like I should apologize. For what? For not stopping him. I shook my head. This wasn't your mistake. She looked toward Ethan. But I watched it happen. I nodded. So did everyone else. No one argued, because it was true. Humiliation almost always has witnesses. Very few people interrupt it. Most simply hope someone else will. Charles Whitmore slowly approached his son-in-law. Ethan. Yes, sir. I've known you for 3 years. You've always treated my daughter well. Ethan nodded. I've admired your work ethic. Another nod. But tonight, Charles paused. I saw something that disappointed me. Ethan didn't defend himself. I know. You judged a man without asking about his life. I did. You measured success with money. I did. Charles sighed. I spent 30 years building my business. He looked toward me. And tonight I learned there are achievements that don't fit on financial statements. He extended his hand toward me. Richard, I hope you'll still consider us family. I shook it firmly. I never stopped. Charles looked surprised. Even after everything, families survive difficult conversations. They don't survive avoiding them. He nodded slowly. I'll remember that. The wedding guests quietly drifted toward the dance floor, giving us space. No one wanted to leave. No one wanted to intrude. General Harris gathered the other retired officers. We'll wait outside. I looked at him. You don't have to. He smiled. I know. But some conversations belong only to family. He gave me one final nod before leading the veterans toward the harbor terrace. As they disappeared through the glass doors, the ballroom somehow felt smaller, quieter, more personal. Ethan finally looked directly at me. When Mom got sick, my chest tightened. I remember. I was angry. I know. I blamed you. I know. His voice cracked. I thought the army mattered more than we did. There it was. The sentence I'd been waiting 20 years to hear. Not because I wanted him to say it, because I needed to know where his anger had begun. It wasn't just the deployments. He wiped his eyes. It was every birthday. Every school play. Every baseball game. I kept looking into the stands. He laughed bitterly. You were never there. I closed my eyes. No, I wasn't. Lauren squeezed his hand. He continued. Mom never complained. She always defended you. Your father is serving his country. Your father loves you. Your father wishes he could be here. His shoulders trembled. I stopped believing her. Those words hurt more than anything he'd said earlier that evening. Not because they were cruel, because they were honest. I pulled out the nearest chair and sat down. Suddenly, I felt every one of my 68 years. Ethan, I owe you an apology. He looked confused. You do? I spent decades explaining leadership to soldiers. I smiled sadly. But I never learned how to explain absence to my own son. He stared at me. I thought providing for you was enough. It wasn't. I thought serving my country would make you proud. It didn't. I thought someday you'd understand. He whispered. I never had the chance. No. I nodded. I never gave you one. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was necessary. Sometimes the truth needs room to breathe. I reached into the inside pocket of my old jacket. There was a folded envelope, yellowed around the edges. I've carried it for years. Emily had written it during her final weeks. She handed it to me one evening in hospice. Don't read it unless Ethan ever loses his way. I never opened it. Not once. Until the night after her funeral. Then I folded it back exactly the way she'd left it. I'd carried it ever since. Ethan. I held out the envelope. Your mother wanted you to have this someday. His hands trembled as he accepted it. Now, I think she'd say the timing is finally right. He carefully unfolded the paper. Lauren stood beside him. He began reading silently. After only a few lines, his face crumbled. Tears rolled freely down his cheeks. He handed the letter to Lauren. She quietly read part of it aloud. If you're reading this, it means your father is probably hurting, and so are you. She stopped to steady her voice, then continued. Please remember something I learned long before you were born. Your father has never loved the army more than he loved his family. He simply believed protecting other families was one way of protecting ours. Lauren looked up. Neither of us could speak. She continued reading. One day you'll discover that good people sometimes make impossible choices. When that day comes, don't waste your life deciding who was right. Spend it loving each other while you still can. The room had become completely silent again. Even guests standing across the ballroom had stopped talking. Emily somehow still had that effect on people. Ethan covered his face. I wasted so much time. I stood. No. He looked at me. You were hurt. There's a difference. I called you a failure. You did. In front of everyone. You did. I don't deserve, I interrupted gently. Don't finish that sentence. He frowned. Why? Because your mother hated when people decided they were beyond forgiveness. He laughed through tears. That sounds like Mom. It does. We stood looking at one another. Neither of us knew who should move first. Then Lauren quietly smiled. I think she would have told both of you to stop being so stubborn. A few nearby guests laughed softly, including me, including Ethan. For the first time in years, we laughed together. He took one hesitant step, then another. Finally, he wrapped his arms around me. I hugged my son tighter than I had since he was a teenager. I missed you, he whispered. I never stopped being here. No. He shook his head against my shoulder. I finally understand. I closed my eyes. So do I. Outside, the harbor lights shimmered across the water. General Harris stood on the terrace with the other veterans. None of them looked inside. They didn't need to. Soldiers know the difference between winning a battle and healing a family. Tonight, the second victory mattered far more. People often imagine reconciliation as one perfect conversation. It isn't. It's 100 small choices made long after everyone else has gone home. That night was only the beginning. The wedding eventually resumed, not because anyone cared about schedules anymore, but because Lauren insisted the day should still end with joy. My mother always says, she smiled through tired eyes, if love survives the hardest conversation in the room, it's worth celebrating. No one disagreed. The band quietly returned. The first dance was delayed nearly 3 hours. Nobody complained. Instead, the guests applauded longer than they had all evening. Not for the dance, for the family standing together beside the dance floor. Before the music began, Ethan walked to the microphone one last time. His hands shook. He looked nothing like the confident man who had mocked me only hours earlier. I owe everyone here an apology. The room fell silent. I spent years believing success could be measured by job titles, money, and appearances. He looked toward me. I was wrong. He swallowed hard. The greatest man I've ever known has been standing beside me my entire life. He smiled sadly. I just didn't recognize him. Then he turned toward me. Dad? His voice cracked again. Would you do me the honor of sharing the first father-son dance before Lauren and I have ours? I looked at him for several seconds. I don't dance very well, General Harris called from the back of the room. Sir, you've led thousands of soldiers. You can survive one dance. The ballroom erupted in warm laughter. I laughed too. Emily would have loved that moment. She always insisted I dance like a man avoiding landmines. Ethan grinned. Mom used to say that. I know. She was right. We walked onto the dance floor together. There was no choreography, no elegance, just a father and his grown son standing awkwardly while an old Frank Sinatra song filled the ballroom. Halfway through the song, Ethan quietly whispered, "I'm sorry I stopped asking about your life." I answered just as quietly, "I'm sorry I stopped telling you about it." That was enough. Sometimes healing begins with two honest sentences. Life settled into a different rhythm after the wedding. Not perfect, real. The kind of real that takes patience. Every Sunday afternoon, Ethan and Lauren came to my house for dinner. At first, they insisted on bringing dessert. Eventually, they stopped asking and simply opened the refrigerator like family. Lauren learned Emily's chicken pot pie recipe from one of her old notebooks. She cried the first time she made it. "So this is what everyone talks about. It was impossible to improve." She smiled. "I know, but I think she'd appreciate the effort." I think she would too. Months passed. The conversations became easier. Less about regret, more about ordinary life. Work, gardening, football, the neighbors, the weather. Exactly the sort of things families are supposed to talk about. One Saturday morning, Ethan surprised me. He arrived carrying several dusty storage boxes. I found these in my attic. Inside were dozens of old photo albums, letters, newspaper clippings, military photographs. Pictures Emily had carefully organized over the years. There was one photograph of me holding Ethan when he was only 3 days old. Another showed him sitting on my shoulders during a county fair. One picture made both of us laugh. I was wearing my dress uniform. Ethan, maybe 5 years old, had covered every medal with superhero stickers. I don't remember doing that. I do. "Were you angry?" "No," I smiled. "You thought Captain America deserved a promotion." Lauren laughed. "I think he still does." For the next several hours, we sorted through memories. Some were joyful, some painful. None were hidden anymore. Not long afterward, Lauren gave birth to a beautiful little girl. They named her Emily. I didn't expect that. When Ethan called me from the hospital, he didn't say, "You have a granddaughter?" He said, "Dad." Emily came home. I couldn't answer for several seconds. When I finally held my granddaughter, she wrapped her tiny hand around my finger. I remembered holding Ethan exactly the same way. Life has a remarkable habit of offering second chances, not to erase the past, to redeem it. As Emily grew older, she became fascinated with the old wooden chest in my study. One afternoon, she pointed at it. "Grandpa, what's in there?" "My old uniforms." "Can I see?" I opened the chest slowly. The 4-star shoulder boards, the medals, the ribbons, everything neatly folded. She looked at them for only a few seconds. Then she asked, "Were you famous?" I laughed. "No. Were you brave?" "Or sometimes." She thought about that. Then she climbed into my lap. "I like Grandpa better." "So do I." I closed the chest. She never asked to see the medals again. Instead, she wanted to bake cookies, build puzzles, feed ducks at the park. Those were victories no ceremony could ever equal. A year after the wedding, Ethan invited me to speak at Career Day at my oldest grandson's elementary school. I almost declined. Then I remembered something Emily used to tell me. Children don't need perfect stories. They need honest ones. I walked into the classroom wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, not a uniform. One little boy raised his hand. "Weren't you a general?" "I was." "Where's your uniform?" "It's at home." "Why didn't you wear it?" I smiled. "Because today I'm here as somebody's grandpa." The children accepted that answer immediately. Adults often complicate what children understand naturally. A few weeks later, my grandson came home with a school assignment. "Who is your hero?" He handed me the paper shyly. "I wrote about you." I adjusted my reading glasses. His handwriting wandered across the page in crooked lines. "My hero is my grandpa Richard. People say he used to be an army general. I think the best thing about him is that he never talks about being important. He helps people without telling anyone. He makes the best pancakes. He says saying you're sorry is brave. I want to grow up like him." By the time I reached the last sentence, I couldn't see the page anymore. My eyes had filled with tears. Ethan quietly placed a hand on my shoulder. "I finally understand what Mom was trying to teach us." "So do I," he smiled. "You know, I used to think your greatest achievement was becoming a general." I looked at my grandchildren chasing one another across the backyard. "No." "What is it?" I smiled. "This." The laughter, the forgiveness, the family that almost fell apart and found its way back. If there's one lesson my life has taught me, it's this. Success may earn admiration. Rank may earn respect. Money may open doors. But none of those things can replace the people waiting for you when you come home. Don't wait for a wedding, a funeral, or a painful mistake to ask your parents about the lives they lived before you knew them. Sometimes the quietest person in the room carries the greatest story. And sometimes the strongest apology isn't spoken in a single moment, it's lived every day afterward. If this story reminded you of someone you love or someone you still have time to forgive, I hope you'll reach out to them today. And if this journey touched your heart, I'd be honored if you shared it with someone who might need the same reminder. Your support, your comments, and your subscription help keep stories like this alive for others who may be searching for hope, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending this time with me.